adequate while the world in which we live is collapsing and maybe near the breaking point.
Yep. Go ahead and read the third. Is someone mind reading the third one?
PCUSA stands united with over 35 other denominations in acknowledging climate change as a profound moral and ethical issue demanding urgent attention and action.
All right. About the fourth one.
Presbyterians are called to take the results of our energy consumption seriously, to pray asking for God's forgiveness and guidance, reduce energy consumption, and to calculate carbon emissions and offset the negative impact.
And then the last one. I can do this one. As a denomination, we have committed ourselves to advocating for policies and practices that address the root causes of climate change and promote environmental justice for all creation, including reducing greenhouse gas emissions, transitioning to renewable energy sources, standing with communities impacted by environmental racism, oppression, or extractive industries, and promoting sustainable and equitable development. Is anyone struck by any of those quotes or anything about those quotes?
I'm struck with Pope Francis, and that's pretty radical. It's collapsing, breaking point. Those are unequivocal.
Yeah. About others? Yeah.
For me, it's Martin Luther King. Okay, headlights rather than the taillights. And he's undoubtedly talking about the civil rights movement, that it applies to climate change and many other things as well.
Yep. Yeah, and it's interesting because I looked up this statement from King, and it was an evolving statement, right? A lot of King's quotes evolve over time and ultimately become concretized into the ones that we see today. But it's like you get bits and pieces of it. And for the most part, early on in his career, he was just frustrated and saying the church is always the taillights following behind. He didn't have the headlights part, right? And eventually he kind of picked that up. But he's, why is the church always the taillights, right? He was kind of lamenting that and frustrated with that. And eventually that quote kind of evolves more into being the leadership of the headlights. I was struck by this idea that we passed a resolution, we passed a overtures, what we call it, is a policy a few years back that is actually calling congregations to take a stance and to work on climate change. And I think that policy comes from its root origins out of two things. One is we churches in many ways have abdicated our responsibility on issues of the environment, on social justice, on hunger, on education, on healthcare to other entities, right? This is other people do that. It's the schools that need to educate. It's the hospitals that take care of healthcare. It's the, food pantries that provide all the food. And in some ways, I think obviously with the collapse of structures and systems that we're seeing now, the church is having to regain much of its focus in these areas, right? And we're seeing a lot of these structures and governmental structures in particular starting to fall apart, and churches were making sandwiches right next door. Last week, we made over 235 sandwiches. They're needing 1,100 sandwiches a week from Bienvenidos Food Bank, right? Things that traditionally have gone to other nonprofits or government structures are starting to fall apart. Bigger national entities are falling apart. And so the struggle then becomes, what is the role of the congregation? And many of you may remember in New Mexico, we have strong roots in education, started many schools across northern New Mexico in particular. And we also started many healthcare centers. There's a reason that you have a hospital named Presbyterian here in this state that's no longer tied to the church, but it's from that kind of history and tradition, as well as there were clinics at many of the churches. Many churches had parish nurses where folks could come and have their blood pressure checked and, their fever checked, or if they had an issue or an ailment, they would come to church and they would have those things. And I think the larger denominations are realizing, especially as some of those bigger upper structures are falling apart, that there needs to be a role of the congregations, and the congregations have to take a stand on these kind of moral and ethical issues. If you look at that statement, right, we have united with over 35 other denominations in acknowledging climate change as a profound moral and ethical issue. What does that mean when you say something like that as a church? Yeah. You're going to say something's profoundly moral and ethical. Saying you better be involved, Christians.
Yeah.
Right?
This is forefront. This is project status up.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. Like this isn't something that you can just say other people are going to handle that. We're going to advocate our responsibility. It's like, this is an environmental issue, right? That's how we like to talk about it. Climate change is an environmental issue, and that's not really my thing. And they're saying to you, no, it's not. It is a moral and ethical issue. And as a person of faith, you better wake up and start caring about this. And we're going to talk about why. Does that make sense? We all breathe air. We all drink water, right? We all have, as the Pope would say, we all have a common home. And if we're destroying that home, it will not only impact us and God's creatures, but it's certainly going to impact how we love our neighbor. And we can't be saying that we're living into God's commandments of love our neighbor if we're destroying their water, their clean air, there's contamination, there's environmental injustices. Can we really say we're loving our neighbor? Right? Is how the last couple popes have frankly spoken.
That's what I was going to say. I was going to tie that moral and ethical issue to the love of neighbor. Who is our neighbors? Vulnerable populations that are most affected. My grandchildren are our neighbor. So I'm glad you made that connection. That's right.
Yep. And I was struck by this statement. Presbyterians are called to take the results of our energy consumption seriously, right? To pray for God's forgiveness and guidance, and to reduce our energy consumption and calculate carbon emissions and to offset their negative impact. This is saying you all need to pay attention to how you're living. And you can't just all of a sudden say, well, sin is a moral issue and it's about sex and it's about this and it's about that. It's also about how you're living in relationship to God's creation, towards one another, towards ourselves. And we need to think seriously about that, towards the resources we're using. And we're going to look at kind of all those things. So this is a great example, right? Public lands in America. Most people, when you think of public lands, what do you think of? National parks. That generally is almost always the answer. But there's 640 million acres of public lands in the United States. I always say that, ancestral lands are public lands, right? These public lands didn't just come out of nothing and we call them public lands, but these were at one point ancestral and tribal lands and still remain so to this day. And these include obviously National Park Service, Bureau of Land Management, U.S. Forest Service, Fish and Wildlife. 27% of the land mass in the United States are public lands. And of course, many people think when you're on public lands, camping, fishing, hiking, skiing. But they're also critical, of course, to carbon storage, to watersheds, to biodiversity and habitat. And this is where it starts to become a very interesting political issue, right? I was just presenting in Arkansas, for example. Look at the amount of acres in New Mexico for public lands, 27 million, right? We call ourselves the land of enchantment. What are we without the health of good land, right? As a people, as an identity, how much of our culture, our history, our traditions, our family identity is tied to the land in this state, right? You go to other states that maybe aren't as public land heavy. Arkansas is 3.1 million acres. There's a lot of forests. There's a lot of important areas. But as you get farther on the east of the Mississippi, you start to have maybe less public lands in certain states. There's maybe less of that identity. And of course, you have to have 100 senators and 435 House of Representative members vote to support these kind of things. And you're saying to them, well, this is why it's an important priority in your area, and we got to get you on board. And they may be coming from lands that have 3 million acres or far less than that, right? And so this is why it's become also a big challenge to say, these are America's public lands. These are part of our identities. These are ancestral and tribal lands. This is core to who we are as a people, but these are also public. This is a very unique kind of concept, right? That obviously coming out of England, coming out of the monarchy, coming out of places still to this day like Scotland, private land ownership was kind of the name of the game. If you wanted to hunt, you had to be in a private land club, even still in Scotland. Many of those clubs are private to be able to fish certain rivers, to be able to hunt certain areas. And this idea of public lands is kind of a very unique and important concept to this country of saying there's a egalitarianism to anybody can go out and enjoy the beauty of the Grand Canyon. Anybody can enjoy the beauty of the Rio Grande Gorge. That's a public land. And that's important to all of us. But there's a push-pull going on there where there's a lot of people obviously wanting to privatize and monetize these things for special interest. And you see that still to this day. And we'll talk more about that. This is kind of the thing that I'm seeing butt up most against public lands right now. There was actually a really interesting article on energy dominance and the threat to tribal sovereignty and ancestral lands just came out last week, an interesting article on that. But energy dominance is more than just kind of a slogan, right? It's an apparatus. It's a set of policies, procedures, councils, ideas, memos that are all coming together in one bigger formation about seeing public lands as an economic resource for development rather than to be protected in shared landscapes, right? That's kind of the bigger thrust of what energy dominance is. And I want, you all have probably heard and talk, and I can certainly send videos on this about this idea of dominion, right? This idea, how I believe that is a mistranslated word within Genesis, and how that word is actually rightfully translated as to rule responsibly, right? The Hebrew word of that. But they are very much cloaking this energy dominance idea in holy language. That God has given us dominion, and therefore we should be able to do whatever we want with our power and our control over things and exploit it however we want. And there's not a coincidence on why the language of energy dominance is being used. They're trying to harken back to those early Genesis texts, which I, as again said, are misinterpreted, to say, we have dominion, we're the only things that matter, humans are the superior, and therefore we can do what we want with these lands. So when you hear a thing like energy dominance, you need to have those alarm bells in your Christian heads go off and say, this is being cloaked in holy garb. This is saying I've got a licensure from the divine to do what I want to do, right? Which is why they're trying to do what they're doing. But it's not just an opinion or ideas. It's codified into the One Big Beautiful Bill Act. And so, of course, one of the big things in that act was trying to sell off public lands and privatize those and sell them to special interests. Many of you probably called in or fought against that. Raise your hands if you did, took strong stances on that. That's awesome. That is a tremendous step. But what a lot of people don't know is happening is that, okay, we're going to keep those lands within the federal hands, but we're going to use them and exploit them at an enormous rate and degree. And so if you're not going to just transfer those over to private industry, we're going to give private industry the licensure to largely do what they want in lots of ways. So there's mandatory quarterly oil and gas sales in 9 states. You see them listed here. And it's basically saying you have to lease in these 9 states. And it strips the BLM of discretion to say no to proposed lease sales in these states. And it's also reducing your public input on public land. And essentially what this is doing, we think about public lands as multiple use, right? I want to hike, camp, ski, do all these things. But we're going to take that multiple use and we're going to make it a singular use. And almost always under this administration, that singular use is extracted. Right? When I have an oil and gas field, say up in the, Four Corners area, as Rob knows, and him and I go fish the San Juan a lot, you're not doing anything else in that area. You're not going to be setting up camp right next to an oil derrick. You're not going to be sitting, a lot of the animals are no longer going to be there to be hunted. You're not going to be fishing in these areas where there's a bunch of sediment and silt because of unmaintained oil and gas paths. So what you're doing is you're taking lands that are held in the public trust and you're turning them from multiple use into a largely singular extractive use. And that's largely what you see in the energy dominance amendment. You see opening up of additional 200 million acres of public lands. 90% of BLM lands are now open for leasing, right? The other thing is you're cutting royalty rates for these companies. So you're basically saying to a private company, you can go lease on public lands and we're going to charge you less to do it. And that money that we were normally charging you to be able to lease would go into a lot of, the general funds, but also go into stewarding those lands for other things like camping and hiking and recreation. But we're going to cut that. So basically, we're letting you say these are public lands, but we're going to give you lots of private use with little money in return. And so here you have this thing that's supposed to generate, revenue, right, in this bill, and they're saying, we're going to cut your royalty rates down and we're going to make it cheaper for you to rent these lands. We're going to give you incentive to do it. So that's one of the big things that the One Big Beautiful Bill did. You want to look at what's going on within this. You see here's from 2017 to 2021 under the previous Trump administration. That you can see is what's being leased. There's over 270 lease nominations right now, currently under this administration. About a fifth of greenhouse gases are coming off public lands. So one of the beauties of public lands was obviously the intention is to be a carbon sink, to be an ecological help, to be a barrier for biodiversity. And now you're seeing them be flipped around, right? And a fifth of greenhouse gases are now coming off public lands. And then you can see what public lands are accounting for. 39% of US coal, 21% of US oil, and 14% of US natural gas. This picture to me is a mind-boggling picture. Y'all know what that is?
Yeah, Lisa, if you want to see post-apocalyptic in real time, go to England.
Yeah. Those are methane clouds taken by NASA. That's a picture of the 2 methane clouds over the 4 corners in the Permian Basin. If you want to know where leasing is occurring, hotbeds right here, all over the place. But look at the clouds of methane over those 4 corners. This, when I started doing these presentations now 10 years ago, this cloud was the size of Rhode Island. Now it's twice the size of Delaware. That's how fast and rapidly that's occurring. Look at our state. Like, we're right here. We're sandwiched in between all of this. You're talking about air quality, talking about other issues, and of course, you have lots of issues that are going on in those communities in terms of environmental justice. And we remain in this boom bust kind of economy. But New Mexico, if you all read the article in the New Mexican today, is the 2nd largest producer of oil and gas nationwide, Texas being the 1st. New Mexico is the 2nd. And most of course, that leaves our state, right?
And one thing that has caught my attention, so more exposed to this information, was the previous slide that showed who's benefiting from it in your information about what a sweetheart deal they're giving to the producers. And it just says that we're selling off the public lands for a few people who make a whole lot of money.
Correct.
And that's the administration's motivation. It's just basically about money being funneled from the public good to a few people.
And we'll talk exactly about the polling on that. So what are the other effects that we're seeing? And this is a mind you, this picture right here was taken by that lovely lady. She went down to the Permian Basin to meet with Interfaith Power and Light folks and other faith leaders to go look at what's happening on the ground at the Permian Basin. As they're looking at one of the methane cameras of an oil and gas well and seeing what the actual methane is being produced, Jen heard or smelled a really noxious smell, kind of wondered where it was coming from. And right behind her, there's a pipeline just spewing crude all over the ground. Again, you're cutting the agencies that are to monitor these businesses and to oversee them. And there was no idea that this was happening. And this leak had been going on for months, if not years. And so this is a picture she literally took maybe right before the government shutdown.
September 26th.
Yeah. Anything else you want to say about that?
So we reported it. Well, I reported it to Andrew. I'm like, oh my gosh, look what I saw. We were looking to the left at a properly capped well. You know, they had the little the gun showing there's no methane fumes coming out, and what a wonderful sight. And I'm like looking to my right, and I wander off. I find this oil spill, and I said, hey, sorry to rain on your parade, but look over here. And after that, they also found, this is one oil company. It's a subsidiary, and this actual well is probably 70 years old. It's dilapidated. It's been sold and sold and sold and sold and sold. And all of the machinery has not, it's just you and I decided we want to go buy an oil field, and we do, and we just keep that same old machinery. They found the holding tank had completely rusted out and all the oil had spilled out. Yeah. So they're pumping, and it's just going straight onto the ground, and they have no idea because they don't live here, they don't monitor. And then I told it to Andrew, and then Andrew
I caused a lot of cane. Right before the government shut down, I got really pissed at all this, and I sent this to all our senators. And I'm like, how the hell is this happening on? These are public lands, right? This is public lands. This is all coming off public lands. And I sent these pictures to Heinrich, and I texted him directly, and I said, this is unbelievable what's happening. And this is what's happening when you cut the budgets of federal agencies that are to monitor this and keep these companies in line, and they don't have resources to send people out to do these inspections and to make sure their pipelines don't have holes in them, and they're literally like this giant tank that's about the size of this room is just flooding oil out of the bottom of it. We have pictures of that too. And so Heinrich got all over it, and of course the government was shutting down at the same time. So when I called the BLM office that we reported it to, no one picks up. So I have no idea what's happening in the Carlsbad field office and who's actually doing anything about it. And this thing in the meantime is just continuing to spew crude all over the ground. This is my point. You have 4 million orphaned and abandoned wells all over the nation, right? These are wells that basically either have the companies walked away, declared bankruptcy, and just left it, or that, those are obviously the orphaned, and that company is no longer around, or the abandoned is like, we're not going to deal with it, right? Like that's not our problem. So, the big issue is not just industry saying we're going to be doing this. And there's, don't get me wrong, there's responsible businesses that take care of things and do things environmentally well. But there's also a lot that have walked away and said, hey, public, some public land's not our problem anymore, right? And we're just going to let you all deal with the mitigation. We're going to leave that up to the states. We're going to leave that up to the tribes. We're going to leave that up to the federal government, like not our issue. And that's a big problem, right? So you're not just seeing these issues on the front end of taking, public lands from multiple use to singular use. On the back end, you're then living with all the ramifications and problems, which are not good for the air, the wildlife. I mean, imagine, the big issue, of course, is you have everything from elk and cattle and pronghorn in these areas. And then some hunter goes out there and shoots one of these, brings it back thinking they're providing locally sourced protein for their family. And in the meantime, they're feeding them a bunch of carcinogens. This is the problem, right? You see this with waterfowl all the time in contaminated water areas. So this is how you're seeing the bigger issues.
So to continue the story, it did get reported to the State Land Office. They issued a 90-day warning. So within 90 days, they have to fix the issue, which is including fixing the leak and the remediation of the land. The problem is, and we'll send out action alerts as soon as they come out. Interfaith Power and Light usually is a very big advocate for policy reform because the state's not collecting the fees. They're not following up. They issue the warning, and we'll be following up in January as those 90 days come to a close. Like, okay, did this get fixed? Did they recoup any money? Is the land back to normal? Did they do the cleanup properly? Like, how do you take responsibility for these actions?
And if you want a good bill to work on in the legislature, there's one that's, again, we're beholden to oil and gas. Basically one that says if you have a history, if your company has a history of these kind of things, we're going to basically apply strict scrutiny, or like the most strict idea of you getting future permits, right? Until you prove that you can do this well. That bill has not gotten passed. Like, it's a no-brainer, right? But that shows you the hold of industry on the legislature. I mean, to me, I'm like, that's ridiculous that they're not passing this. But that's a bill that's out there, and one that we need to look at more critically coming up into these sessions. Here's what's amazing to me. Conservation in the West Pole, done by Colorado College for decades now, one of the most respected polls on conservation. 72% of Westerners prefer their elected officials place more emphasis on protecting clean water sources, air quality, and wildlife habitat. 24% prefer their elected officials to prioritize more domestic energy production. So the majority of people, almost 3/4 of people, are saying, we believe in conservation, we believe in habitat, we believe in protecting these areas. Even self-identified mega voters are split. 51% favor emphasis on protecting public lands, 44% want to maximize oil and gas protection. That's wild, right? So that's some of the polling. And you can see it over the years, like it's just growing stronger, right? You're up to 72% from 65% in 2019. Then you look at oil and gas development, specific questions. 72% of voters oppose removing protections for parts of existing national public lands to allow for more drilling. Basically saying we're not going to get rid of national monuments, or we're going to get rid of, make adjustments to things like the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge to allow for more oil and gas drilling. 92% support keeping requirements that oil and gas companies, rather than taxpayers, pay for the cleanup and land restoration costs. 88% support continuing to require public lands, oil and gas producers to use updated equipment and technology to prevent leaks. What this is telling you, though, is that the majority of voters in these states support conservation ethics, support biodiversity, support wildlife habitat. Why are their politicians voting against this? The majority of their voters are telling them money and special interests, right? This shows you the power of the lobbies, the power of the PACs. If the majority of your voters in Nevada or Wyoming or New Mexico, and this is across those 8 Western states, are telling these folks, this is what we stand for and believe in, and then they're voting for other policies, one, it shows 2 things. One is somebody else has got the power over these politicians. But 2, what it's also really showing is that there's a lack of accountability on the back end. These companies know that they can produce enough commercials to give these politicians cover that people aren't going to say to them, hey, you're voting against what I actually want you to do. And so this poll is showing some of that cognitive dissonance in the American political identity. What is this leading to? Look at the impacts to God's creatures. You look at 1 million animal and plant species are now faced with extinction. Extinction rates are 10 to 100 times higher than average. There's at least 680 vertebrate species that are already extinct due to human actions, and over 15,000 sources from 145 experts in 50 countries. This is the most comprehensive wildlife study that's ever been done in the history of the world, showing these numbers. You can look at how does this compare with extinction risk of US species, and you can see everything from freshwater snails up here to mussels to crayfish, terrestrial snails, everything from butterflies and skippers to birds. And you can kind of see what the imperiled is kind of the orange, the critically imperiled is red, the blue is presumed or possibly extinct, and then you have vulnerable, right? And so you can kind of see what's happening in the breakdown. What do you see from the chart? Like, why would you talk about freshwater snails or environmental or mussels or flowering plants? Yeah, because you're getting at indicator species, right? Indicator species are those species that indicate there's a bigger issue going on within the larger ecosystem. When you start having all of the pollinators die off because there's no longer any flowering plants, you got a big problem, right? And you start having things like freshwater snail and these lower, smaller creatures that tend to feed the whole ecosystem in various ways, shapes, and form, they're indicating there's a bigger problem. So when you start seeing lots of red and things like that, that's indicating a ecosystem in distress, right? Here you see kind of those same things on the larger animals, mammals, bony fish, sharks, stingrays, amphibians, all kinds of things. And it's showing you what is of the least concern and what is the most vulnerable and endangered in percentage of each species in each category. So what does that actually mean in terms of numbers? 150 US species have already gone extinct. There's 150 species that myself and Brooke and the rest of children will never see. More than 1,600 species are listed under the Endangered Species Act. And a third of all US fish and wildlife are at risk of extinction. And there you kind of see some of that, right? You can kind of see starting with those what quote unquote indicator species. You also have keystone species, right? So we talked about indicator species. They're like the barometer that tell you what's going on in the bigger system. Keystone species are species with a disproportionately large effect on the structure of an ecosystem. So sea otters control urchins, right? And you remove all the sea otters, then the kelp forests start to die. Or beavers make dams allowing for wetlands, and you start to remove all the beavers, and there's no longer wetlands, and the species that rely on wetlands, like the majority of birds, start to die off. Right, so you have a shift happening in the keystone species. If you look, you have bigger mammals starting to be impacted. You have indicator species, keystone species, right, starting to shift around. And it's telling you basically the top of the ecosystem that shapes the ecosystem. Wolves, for example, that tend to prey on weaker, sicker animals, or sharks over here, and your other things like your freshwater mussels. Both are showing serious signs of distress. What are the causes of this? This is some interesting data. Massive habitat and ecosystem loss, habitat degradation, and overdevelopment. We're basically converting land into other things, right? Whether that's agriculture, whether that's strip malls, whether that's condo areas. Look at the city of Santa Fe on the south side. Look at where I live over kind of right off Governor Miles. That area was all pinyon and juniper, pretty much scrub, right? Now it's a hospital, a VA clinic, all good things. But we're not at all considering what are the impacts to red-tailed hawk and why there's no rabbits or anything else in the area in terms of those kind of things, right? Road runners, all kinds of things. And so all of a sudden it's death by 1,000 cuts, right? And we have all these condos and all this housing and all these strip malls and all this, development and the gravel pit and the mine over here. And all of a sudden, where do the animals go? Right? Where are God's creatures moving around? And of course, you see that over thousands of years, species becoming less and less able to adapt. It takes time for us to adapt, right? All of a sudden, I send you to Minnesota in the middle of winter, the clothes you're wearing. What is the first thing you're going to try to go do? Yeah, you're going to go seek shelter and you're going to try to buy a new coat, right? Well, that's what we're doing to these animals. We're trying to say, okay, all of a sudden you got to live in a place where it's much hotter or much colder or more fierce storms or there's fires. And we're saying to you, we expect you to be able to go buy a coat and adjust and change your entire environment. And of course, these species take thousands of years to have those adaptations. And so they're not adjusting with the speed of climate, right? If climate changes too quickly, organisms don't have the time to adapt to new conditions. There you see koala in the fires of Australia, right? We're a species. Human beings are a species, right? We're one of God's species. Look at what's happening with us. Look at natural disasters. This is a mind-boggling chart. Look at the flow of natural disasters over the last 40 years. 40 million global climate refugees. Just huge shifts in the amount of natural disasters that are costing our country billions of dollars. Look at the floods in Texas, right? Hurricane Katrina converting an entire city, and now they're rebuilding it all and trying to figure out how to still deal with the Ninth Ward. All of those issues going on year and year again. And you look at the rate, it's not that natural disasters didn't occur in the 1980s. It's that we're dealing with 9 of them, not 60 of them a year. Right? And so you're seeing the rapid amount of natural disasters starting to explode, impacting human communities, obviously, people as species, amount of refugees. If you care about social justice, you have to care about the environment. And those kind of committees, and that's what I've been really pushing our social justice committee on, is like, why are people moving? Why are people refugees? Why are people leaving their areas? Yes, some of it's government hostilities. Some of it's the ability to, I can no longer grow any of the food I want. The forest in my entire community are destroyed, and there's erosion issues and flooding issues. Places like Guatemala, right? El Salvador. Wasn't it just human overpopulation? Isn't that what climate change has caused? There's just too many people on the planet. Yes and no. It's also how people are living on the planet. 50% of the least developed countries have contributed 1% of greenhouse gases. US, EU, and China contribute 60% of greenhouse gases. US is 4% of the world's population. We consume 1/3 of the natural resources. All human beings are not created equal, as it turns out. Where you live, how you live, and the environment size have a huge say in how the world is feeling your impacts. Right? We live in one of the most developed countries with expectations that I can go to the grocery store, I'm going to buy all of this stuff, I'm just going to throw it out, somebody else is going to pick it up, and they're going to take it to someplace I don't even know about. Right? I don't have to reuse these things. I can just go buy a new one every time. So it's not human overpopulation. It's also how the humans are living in certain populations. And you look at it from these kind of charts. And that's a really critical thing, because what does that mean for us?
Also, a lot of hidden things, that I learned recently that, all the AI and more computers and more computers.
That's right.
Making life better for everybody. And then there's a little piece that I just learned about the water it takes
It's insane.
to cool everything.
I presented a whole presentation on that.
Produce, oh my gosh,
Yeah.
it was mind-blowing.
Yeah, we're talking, 2 to 8 million gallons just to start it up, just for the internal cooling system. And that's good because it's a closed system and it will stay there. But then you have literally close to 200,000 gallons a day for basically their swamp cools to keep the systems cool above the surface, right? And you put that in a place like Las Cruces. And it's hilarious because our state is in a knockdown, drag out brawl over the one in Las Cruces. Do you know how many they have over in Arizona? 114 data centers in Phoenix area. So you driving around there, Jen and I were just there. I mean, you just see this big building with no windows. It's just like the size of a city block. No one really knows what it is. And it's just there in the middle of Phoenix, right? And of course, we're saying we got to keep jobs and we got to make sure we don't lose everything to Arizona. And that's the big fight down in southern New Mexico over one data center. Meantime, they've got 114 of those things over in Arizona. And the amount of water and the amount of resources that go into that. And of course, the issue is I want this most exact, fastest, best answer over just looking at Google. Right? So I'm going to ask AI. And of course, we have a generation that is now the only way I can do my homework is on AI and how to deal with that. And so there's all these kind of things, and you're not getting rid of that. You got to figure out how to live with it. And so we're looking at everything. How do you take produced water from oil and gas wells? Can you take some of the most destructive contaminants that are in that, remove those out, and use some of that water for a data center? Maybe, but there's companies looking into that. So what's going on? This report just came out a couple weeks ago. This is the State of the Climate report. It comes out every year. 2024 was the hottest year on record, new global temperatures. Ocean temperatures reached an all-time high with the largest ocean bleaching of reefs ever occurring. 2024 fossil fuel consumption hit a record high. Solar and wind, they are also doing records, but they're still 31% lower than fossil fuels. You'll see, and there's a great article in the New Mexican today about exactly this, about the Sunzia wind farm, how it's comparing with fossil fuels, all these other issues. 22 of 34 planetary vital signs are at record levels. That's the really startling thing, right? All these things that they look at, whether it's temperature, species, I mean, they calculate all of these variables in to what is the health of the planet. 22 out of the 34 are flashing red right now. This study, I just wanted to read you a quote out of it because I was so struck by the language of scientists saying this. And they said this. This was literally the quote from the report. We are hurtling toward climate chaos. This is the start of the report. The planet's vital signs are flashing red. The consequences of human-driven alterations of the climate are no longer future threats. They are here now. This unfolding emergency stems from failed foresight, political inaction, unsustainable economic systems, and frankly, misinformation. Almost every corner of the biosphere is reeling from intensifying heat, storms, floods, droughts, or fires. The window to prevent the worst outcome is rapidly closing. In early 2025, the World Meteorological Organization reported that 2024 was the hottest year on record. This was likely hotter than the peak of the last interglacial period 125,000 years ago. Rising levels of greenhouse gases remain the driving force behind the escalation. These recent developments emphasize the extreme insufficiency of global efforts to reduce greenhouse gas emissions and mark the beginning of a grim new chapter for life on Earth. Well, there's scientists saying that. That's like a, start of a novel, a horror novel. But it's not. It's biblical. Hosea 4:1-3. There is no faithfulness or loyalty, no knowledge of God in the land. Swearing, lying, and murder and stealing and adultery break out. Bloodshed follows bloodshed. Therefore the land mourns, and all who live in it languish. Together with the wild animals and the birds of the air, even the fish of the sea are perishing. Who bears the brunt of human lawlessness, sin, and nonsense? Creation. Ezekiel, wherever the river goes, every living creature that swarms will live, and there will be very many fish. It will become fresh. On the banks of both sides of the river, there will grow all kinds of trees for food. Their fruit will be for food, and their leaves will be for healing. Also shows the vision of harmony with God, the new plant and the new heaven and earth. Revelation picks up on Ezekiel's text talking about the river of God in Revelation 21 and 22. This is what restoration looks like. So on the one hand, the land and creation bear the sins of humanity and the brokenness. On the other hand, creation will also be an indicator of the harmony with God, right? It is an indicator of all of how things are going, right or wrong. And right now, you all know how things are going. That's what Hosea and Ezekiel are saying 2,500 years ago. Wild, right? This is one of my quotes that I feel deepest in my soul right now. One of the penalties of an ecological education is that one lives alone in a world of wounds. Much of the damage inflicted on the land is quite invisible to the layperson. And ecologists must either harden their shell and make believe that the consequences of science are none of their business, or they must be the doctor who sees the mark of death in a community that believes itself well, does not want to be told otherwise. Although Leopold said that quote 70 years ago. It's denialism, right? Whether it's in this church, whether it's in this world, we have got to come to terms with what's going on and the truths of the realities and find ways that we can make a difference. What are ways that we can kind of try to deal with some of these issues? This is why Peace USA took this bigger stance, all the stuff that I was just talking about, and they came up with these 3 pathways for decreasing carbon footprints. But notice they're in congregations. They're saying you got to start local. You got to start where you are. Yes, we got to work on those bigger policies. There is no doubt. And that is a lot of what my life is dedicated to. And right now, I'm going to be honest with you, it is hard as hell and frustrating. And for every step that we took forward, we're taking 2 back. I get it. And I get we need to be at that systemic macular level, right? At the same time, we're not even doing our own share in our own little fiefdom. What are we really doing? And how can the church be a light unto the world? You know, what Jesus talks about. How do you show the world what transformation and vision and hope looks like, what sacrifice looks like, what living in more harmony looks like? And that's what the denominations say. So it talks, you can see why the average use of church use of natural gas and why these are concerned. Average church use of electricity. This is just nationwide. And, you know, kind of ultimately what this kind of looks like for our congregation, we're going to look into. So here's our electricity and consumption and annual cost. Come on, Dan, you can jump in.
Oh, go for
They
it.
hear enough from me. I'm done preaching. I'm done preaching. Come on, jump in. Go talk about this.
All right. So this is the cheeky portion of the presentation where we're going to start talking about some of the dirty.
This is our congregation, our church building.
Yeah, some of our impacts. And we've been looking at the data for the last 5-6 years, and we knew there was a problem a while ago, and we did an energy audit, and we've made some progress, and we'll talk about the good, the bad, and the ugly. So just a quick example. The green is where we are today, and this is just for electricity. So electricity, I think, is our lowest hanging fruit. It's kind of the easiest thing I think we could fix. Most of it is lighting. We have over 50 different types of light bulbs in this building. And some of them are not, most of them, 90% probably, are not energy efficient. They're halogen, they're fluorescents. It's very low hanging fruit to, how many Presbyterians does it take to change a light bulb? That's where we're at. That's really where we're at. How many Presbyterians will it take to say, hey, let's drop this energy consumption by changing some light bulbs? Now, it does get a little bit more complex where some of these are recessed lighting and there's canisters and you got to replace the canister in order to hold a new light bulb. But still, so there's a little bit of a financial impact.
I just turned it on. Did you see that? There's a balance in there. Rob will get real nerdy on these issues. Notice these are fluorescent lights. They're not LED. See how it takes a while? It has to heat up that balance. All that energy every time has to go through that balance just to turn on a light bulb.
And the rundown is the same. It's just a little bit
All the
of a delay.
You see around, right?
So here we are. So in 22, we started reducing our energy. We made a few changes. We did our energy audit. We realized how many bad bulbs we had. We took the easiest route and took some of them that didn't require rewiring, and we just literally changed the light bulb. And so our electricity bill starts going down. And you'll notice 2020 is the highest, knock on wood, the highest we have had so far of energy consumption. That's during the pandemic. We didn't come here. It was just the preschool, and they had all the lights on. They are our biggest consumers, not by their fault, just by the fact that they occupy the building the most amount of time. But at that time, they also had all the windows open. So you're heating and cooling the building, and everything's going out the windows, literally. And then as we started coming back, we're walking through the building, we're turning off lights more frequently. Our electricity bill started becoming lower because of the mindsets. We started putting stickers on the light switches, like turn them off when you're done, turn off the light in the bathroom when you're done. And so we started slowly going back down. Now we're peaking, and the green for 2025, we still have the last 2 months to add in. So we're going to be we're going to surpass 23. We're going to be close to the same consumption as last year. In fact, the cost has risen just slightly, and our consumption has stayed equal. So we'll be paying more for the same amount of energy that we're using. These are low-hanging fruits that we need to address right now.
And the big thing is energy is not getting cheaper, it's getting more expensive, right? You're paying $70 more a month and using the same amount. So you'll be like, oh, well, we just budgeted in our budget for the same energy cost. No, it's not going to work, right? We have to start looking at the total of this.
Well, it's also supply and demand. If you're going to have more energy needed for AI, all the prices across the board are going to go up. Same thing with gas. Gas fluctuates based on how cold it is and how many people are using it. And I guess fortunately it's a warmer winter, so we're not using as much gas, and our gas bill has gone down quite a bit. The cost rose slightly, and we have just slightly reduced the consumption of therms of natural gas. We'll talk about more of this in a second. We'll look at our water. Our water is astronomical. We've had a couple of leaks. Same thing with the gases. We had a big gas leak, so our gas numbers were a little off in the 22, 23 range. But our water consumption is both internal, but also irrigation. So there's irrigation reforms that we can do to implement better. Instead of hand watering, we can have it on a timer. Our timers have been breaking, so it's been piecemeal on whether we're hand watering things, which is a lot more wasteful than having it on a drip irrigation. The rooftop garden needs a big reform, and I'm hoping that will help bring down our water consumption. Now we're missing 3 months. So once again, we're gonna be higher than 23, hopefully not as high as last year, but still, we need to start being mindful of how much water we consume. We do have some great new additions, like our dishwasher is extremely efficient. So if we're washing dishes, use the dishwasher because it takes 3 minutes and it's highly, I think you can run, what was it, 7 loads with just 1 gallon of water. I mean, it's really efficient
Yeah, it's
use,
amazing.
much better than hand washing. So we have implemented things. We just have to have people knowing the best way to save water in our building.
And what we're really talking about is creating a culture, right? You have to create a culture. You'll notice that light switch that I turned off, it said, please turn off lights. That sticker has been taken off because people thought it was ugly, right? This is what I'm talking about. You want to get a bird in my bonnet as a pastor here? These are the things, right? Because you know what's real ugly is looking at that koala standing on that tree that's burned up. That's what we're facing. I mean, we're facing a mountain that has our reservoirs like they did in Raton that had a huge tract fire that I worked on when I was with Binghamton's office. Damn near destroyed their water supply, would have shut down that entire community if they hadn't taken drastic actions, right? But we see that in California too. That's what real ugly looks like for some of these changes.
So
A lot of the things like in this room, those lights come on, these lights come on. We don't need
Right.
aesthetics is what it is.
And turning the lights off, right? Turning them, yep.
Need more light.
That's very true. And some of them can be on sensors, especially like in the hallways
Closets.
or on the stairwell. They
Bathrooms.
don't need to be on during daylight hours when it's pretty bright. You didn't even notice they're on. So there's a lot of different things that we can fix. And this is where you get your checkbook out because it's kind of a tragedy of the commons. We have our workspace, we have our home space, and as Starbucks would always say, you have your third place. And this could be your third place. And we have to kind of take into consideration, how do we use it? And how do we use the resources appropriately? Because we're all using it. We're all using the space. Sometimes you feel it's hot. Sometimes you feel it's cold. Sometimes the lights are on. Sometimes they're not. But it's the tragedy of the commons of we don't really pay the bills. We aren't looking how it's broken down. We're paying over $20,000 in electricity a year. We're paying $6,000. This is when we had the big gas leak between the 2020 and 2023. We had a big gas leak, so our average got really high. But even last year, it was roughly $3,000, and it'll be the same this year. Our water bill is extremely high, but you don't see that. You're not writing the check yourself. If we saw that, we would be like, oh.
Yeah,
Let's fix that.
Santiago and Diego leave on their lights all the time and leave the water running in the bathroom. I believe you'd be going nuts, right? Exactly, because we're stewards of that and we feel the pain of those bills. We also know what it's doing to the environment. But when you share a space, everyone says, well, everyone else will take care of it. And I don't got to personally write the bill, check the P&M, and I don't really know. But right now, that's the point of this kind of presentation. Right now, right? Like we're saying, here's what's going on. And there's a reason I'm presenting this in terms of our stewardship campaign. Roger and I talk a lot about our stewardship campaign because stewardship's not just the money you bring in. Stewardship's how you're treating the environment, how you're using your gifts. Do I want to be paying $21,000 a year to the, as a minister standing up in front of you asking for money saying, give $21,000 a year to P&M? No, I want to tell you, give $21,000 a year to the food bank. Give $21,000 a year to New Mexico Interfaith Power and Light. Give $21,000 a year to Bienvenidos, to the border, right? Like that money's real money in some of these communities that we work on. So it may not sound like a lot, but $21,000 in some of these communities that I work in is like life-changing resources, right? But we're giving it to the power company. So you can see, this is the amazing thing. When we started this energy audit 5 years ago, we spent $107,000 on electricity in this congregation. We, at that same time, had solar companies come out and do an estimate. It would cost to fill up to, from somewhere to 70 to 85% of our electricity needs is what we could be, depending if we do all the retrofitting, right? 70% if we don't, 85% if we do, with about the panels that could be on our roof, and it would cost about $100,000.
Well, actually, before the tax credit expired, it was 75.
Yeah.
Oh.
So
yeah,
you look at what we've spent on electricity and what we could have saved on electricity and what we could save long-term on electricity. And this is some of the challenge, right? Like, do we have vision? Do we think about these things? Do we want to be raising $30,000 a year for natural resources every single year when those rates are going to only go up and our consumption seems to also be going up, right? $30,000 is the low benchmark. You know, in 10 years from now, when Brooks 15, is it going to be 40,000, 45,000, right? Like, is that what we're talking? How do we sustain that as a congregation? It's interesting when I grew up in this town. A lot of the houses that were all around downtown, right, were old Hispanic families. A lot of the kids that I grew up with, their grandparents grew up in houses all over this area. They no longer live there. Why was it? It became unaffordable, right? Bills went up in various ways, shapes, and forms, whether it was taxes, whether it was all of these utilities, and ultimately those families couldn't afford to live in the historic areas. Well, why do we think we're any different as a church? You know, everything up is going up around us. We're going to have an O'Keefe Museum that's going to be huge and spectacular and drive lots of people here. Do you think the city is just going to sit back and go, just keep things in the downtown super cheap, right? They're going to be wanting revenue. Utilities are going up. We have to think in a more visionary way. We also have to be just frankly aware of where we're spending our money, right? And this is why, you know, some of you are on finance. Dick Lindahl's on finance and on the session. Roger's on the session. Mark's on the session. You all will hear me get a little riled up, but I'm like, look, what are we doing here? Because how do we sustain this so that my daughter, when she's 15, this church is still around here? And there's a youth program. There's other things going on for her. But we're paying $30,000, $45,000 a year for electricity, oil and gas, heating, right? And also, I think being aware of what this does to the planet. So here's what our church is doing. This is what our consumption actually means.
So just basically, you can do this with your own bills. You can type it into the U.S. They have a converter that just takes your actual bill and gives you some real life explanation of what that really means. You know, what does 59 metric tons of CO2 produced by our electricity every year really relate to? And you can, you know, heat 11 homes very nicely with that. You can have, it takes like 63 acres of a US forest to take in that much carbon. So 63 acres. And that's just the electricity. You take that and you compound it with the gas, which, you know, we do use less gas and electricity, but still it has quite a huge impact when you realize just how much CO2 we're producing, how much we are giving out to that environment, and how much we can quantify our impact on climate change is. You know, it's an extra 14 cars that we're not driving, that are driving. You know, that's how much we are consuming and the urgency of what we can do. So
yeah, you know, this is like EPA estimates challenging congregations on these very things about, you know, if every house of worship just cut energy use by 10%, you know, you'd have $200 million that could go back into other projects, 5.4 billion kilowatt hours of electricity. You know, 200 million tons of greenhouse gases would not be emitted. This is just if we just 10%, which is honestly minimal sacrifice, turning off lights, basic things, making sure doors are closed, that the heat's not always cranking when no one's here, all those kind of things, right? And then there's, you know, more aggressive forms. So what are some of the things we've done? And this has been interesting because, you know, people are like, well, it's Earth Keepers, and we do a lot of stuff outside the congregation, but we've done a lot in the congregation. So we get grants from different funders and stuff like that, and I'll always get like administration fees as part of those grants. Like in, you know, one of the grants I have from Western Conservation Foundation, and I'll take those administration fees and I'll pay a little bit to the bookkeeper for the church, sure. But then I'll also be like, you know what? Rob and I are going to go guerrilla on this church, and we're going to change out all of the bathroom lights in the upstairs that are always left on over the weekend by the teachers that use them the most. And we're going to go change those all out, and they're going to have motion sensors. And we're going to put motion sensors in the deacon's closet. And so one day, Rob and I I'll just go buy that with some Earth Keepers administration funds, not the church's money. And we'll go and we'll literally like change out those things one day. And all of a sudden people walk in, the light will turn on, and they'll be like, what the hell? And it's, you know, but that's kind of how we've had to do things around here, right? Rob and I spent, you know, a good amount of time doing all of that, right? Jen, when she redid the youth room, did all kinds of environmental things, sustainable flooring, all kinds of stuff to be mindful. But it's constantly like those things. And we haven't had the bigger cultural push and support by the session, by the congregation. It's been guerrilla warfare in changing these things out. And then you see what they're doing. Our energy bills went down. And everyone's like, oh, great. We don't need to do anything. Our bills are going down. Well, it's because we've been like sneaking in and putting in, the deacon's closet, which was always left on. We now have a motion detector light, right? Didn't do anything other than when you walk in, the light goes on. When you walk out, it eventually goes off. Bathrooms, same thing.
And there's a lot of misinformation. We're downtown, we're in a historic building. We had a lot of backlash when we just wanted to tint the windows. There's south-facing windows in the preschool, and they would have the heat on the north side, but the air conditioning on the south side, because all that sun was coming in. So you had heat and air conditioning on at the same time. Like, well, why don't we just tint those windows? First of all, you can't even see those windows from the public, but tinting was fine. We can tint all the windows. And we did most of them. We did all of the third floor, second floor, and some of the first floor on like the south facing. So it can block some of that heat. It doesn't change it in the winter because we still use our natural gas, but in the summer, it drastically reduced the amount of air conditioning we needed in those rooms.
Yeah, so instead of paying from that grant administrative fees for the copier, I said, let's tint the windows, right? Because we're going to be in these offices, we're going to be in these areas, and if the overall heating and cooling system collapses because we're running heat and cool all at the same time, that's an administrative fee, right? So let's go ahead and cut that. So we paid for tint on the second and third floor of the church with earth keepers.
And the other myth was that we can't have solar because we're historic, but that has been proven.
Yeah, so San Miguel Chapel, the oldest church in the country, literally put solar on there. And you should see the retrofitting they had to do that. But they accomplished it. And they were in the front page of the New Mexican. Oldest church in the country goes green, right? So if San Miguel Chapel can literally put solar on it and go underneath into these catacombs to deal with their wiring, come on.
So go back to how many Presbyterians does it take to change the light bulb?
Right.
So here we are.
And the answer to that is change.
Here are the reforms that we still are hoping to make, and that.
Yeah. So the elevator lights are not LED, and they're on 24/7. You ever notice? You go in, the elevator's always lit. 24/7. Those lights are on all the time, right? Motion detecting lights on the first floor bathrooms and closets. Replacing fluorescent lighting in Pope Hall in the Rendon room in the chapel, right? Creating a culture of composting. Food waste is an enormous contributor to greenhouse gases, right?
All the methane of the
We provide free compost bags. If you go up to that area right there, the Earth Keepers kind of area right in the front of the church, there's free compost bags. Literally, all you got to do is take those to your house, throw whatever scraps of food you want in there, beans, vegetables, bones, bring that back. There's 2 compost bins right in the basement of the church. Just drop it in. You don't have to do anything more. You don't pay anything. Just take them and do them. Because that's the thing we're also trying to do, is to say, okay, what of these changes can you make in your own lives and in your own house? And if we all start to do this, right, at the congregational level, and that was kind of my thing, okay, Jen and I have solar panels on our house. Okay, great. Jen and I have put in split units, and we run those at very low temperatures on the heat and the cold, and those are all electric running off our solar. Okay, great. Then we decided, okay, we're going to move to a electric water heater that Rob helped us put in. Now we have an electric water heater that's not running off of gas, that runs off of our solar. So we're making all these changes in our home, and I'm like, why am I doing that when there's a 30,000 square foot building right smack in the middle of downtown that is using 25 times more than Jen and I could ever use? But we may actually have a say on that. We may actually be able to change that. Or do we just accept it at the places we work, the places we recreate, right? Or do we try to challenge those systems and structures to say, maybe you can make some of these changes, right?
I'll never fix it. Go back to Martin Luther King, quote. When corporations, big corporations, are putting in their budgets and their future planning, that they will go carbon neutral by X date, and churches not doing that. I think that's where, unless you build it in. I work at Habitat for Humanity, same struggle. We build our houses net zero, solar panels, 100% electric, net zero homes. Yet, the office administration or Restore, I cannot get them to move to put on solar, to do those things, because they're always prioritizing something else in the budget. They want to paint the building. They want to, put in new flooring to make it look prettier. They want to do, it comes down to priorities, right? And how you're going to spend it. If you don't have a plan and it's not on the budget, then it's just, commando actions going in and trying to do that. Doesn't get the big picture number.
Right. And it doesn't shift a culture, right? Because the hope is not to just shift, okay, what is this building and whatever its impacts, and can we lower that and also be more sustainable financially, right? That's the honest one. If you want to just look at numbers, look at the numbers, right? You can say, I don't believe in climate change. Fine, I don't care. Look at the numbers. At the end of the day, do you want to be spending $30,000 on, electricity and gas and water minimum, right? From a financial stewardship perspective.
Well,
If you
from
do
a-
care about the climate, then let's look at these other impacts and what it's actually doing to the environment, right? And to future generations.
Well, to use stewardship language, if you put money towards this, you're matching your funds by reducing, your money's going further. So if you put the, $10,000 towards fixing the lighting, you've reduced your bills. So yeah, the money went in, but you should be reaping a lot more reward.
Yeah, like right now, Jen and I, for our electric bills, we were paying close to what? A month.
Most months it's $0. When it's wintertime, maybe $11.
So what were we paying before?
Oh gosh, 150, 200.
Yeah, so we've paid off all of our solar panels already, right? From when we put them in years ago. So, that's kind of the bigger challenge is like, can you have the vision and foresight to think that way? Or do you just kind of react to the tyranny of the urgent, right? This is just what's happening now, and we're going to keep playing whack-a-mole, right? And so we never really get ahead. We're always falling behind. And that's one of the big visions I think we have to have for the church is, we talked about stewardship and vision. Like, what is the vision here? What does it look like in 10 years? What is our model to the outside world? I mean, here I am speaking at these earth care conferences nationwide to 180, 200, leaders across the country. And then they're going to say, well, what's he doing at his church? Right? What's our model here? Like, how do we walk the walk that we're actually talking about? What kind of future does Santiago and Diego have? What do we want them to have? How does their church say, we support you in learning, but, when your community's burning down and everything's going to hell and there's no water, sorry, right? Like we have, and I would say more than any other generation, the generations below me, they distrust that about institutions. But if institutions aren't walking the walk and they're talking about all these things and they're not actually living into them, there's a reason. I love this idea like, oh, why aren't there any more youth in the church? Because they're going to look at it. What is the church doing to make it more just? What is the church doing to make it more ethical? What is the church doing to alleviate problems, not create problems? What is the church doing on the environment? Hence why the Pope is like, yeah, we're losing a lot of Catholics. We need to be better on all of these things. And you're seeing them get out there in much more radical stances because they're getting it. They're seeing it. Like the younger people care about these issues. You look at polling of young people in any of the elections. It's climate change is number one issue, hands down, right? Then you have all kinds of other issues that go with it. But like that, you can't just be like, oh, we're losing youth in the church. And then at the same time, they're going to be like, well, does your church have solar panels? Do you guys compost? Do you do this? Do you do that? Like, because what kind of future do I have? And I think that's an unspoken tension in churches today. We have generations of people who are in their 70s, 80s, maybe 90s. We're saying, I don't need to live with these consequences, And that's not said, but I'd rather have a nicer looking floor. And the younger people were like, screw the floor when everything's burning down around you, right? Like that's some of the unspoken that we have to be really honest with in the church is like, how are we stewarding future generations and what does that look like? And are we honestly saying, it's not going to be more time. I'm probably not going to be around for this. I don't need to worry about 20 years from now. It's not going to be my issue. So I think we have to be honest with that. But I'd love for your all's thoughts, reflections, ideas.
And some of us are newer to the church. Where is this emphasis, this matter housed in the structure of the session? Is there a committee?
Yes.
Committee or what?
I'm super glad you asked that. So we used to be an Earth Care congregation, right? We have a nice little plaque in the hallway there. But when the folks on that committee got older, some of them passed away, some of them moved away, it got subsumed into mission and social justice. And then largely just kind of the environment was like, well, that's not mission and social justice. So one of the things I'm working to try to do, and would love anyone who's interested to be a part of this, and I've talked to Rob and I've talked to Mark and some others around here, Sam, about getting a new Earth Care committee going and saying, this is a formal committee that will actually ask the session through motions to take stances on certain things. Do we want to move towards solar panels? Do we want to retrofit this lighting? Do we want to challenge the church during, April when Earth Day is to do following activities, right? Because that's how our governance and structure works, right? But we also haven't paid our Earth Care dues, right, from this congregation. And so to be an Earth Care church, which is kind of a formally designated church, we were one of the first ones in the Presbyterian that was an Earth Care congregation, but it just kind of fell away. So, you know, the idea of resuming some of that and saying, you know, it doesn't need to be like a super bureaucratic committee, but, you know, can we get together once a month, share some pizza, and talk about like, what do we want to do here? Because Earth Keepers does a lot of the policy level, bigger, outside reaching, systemic change kind of stuff, right? Carmichael's working on acequias in northern New Mexico and environmental flows and how to get the river to be respected as a river. You know, I'm working a lot on national monuments and the Arctic and other kind of things like that, Chaco Canyon, right? But who's actually taking care of the building and our footprint and changing the culture and talking to the congregation? We used to, you know, the Earth Care tidbits, many of you are on the Earth Keepers newsletter. If you're not, leave your email with Jen, she can put you on it. It's awesome. But the Earth Care tidbit used to be printed in our bulletin every Sunday. Now Earth Keepers does it because we just got rid of it from our bulletin. We used to have a tidbit say, here's what you can do for the environment. Every Sunday people would see that. We used to have that, no longer. So how do we kind of get back to that culture? How do we create the structures within the governance to support those kind of things? Because you're going to run into a facilities committee that says, well, we want $400,000 for stucco, and we want new carpet in this room, and we want, you know, and the roof seems really hard because the roof, we don't know if it will hold solar panels, so let's just not do it. You have to have another committee that's going to say, we have overtures from the national offices, and this is a moral and ethical issue, and we got to work through hard problems, right? No problem can be solved by the same level of consciousness that caused it, Einstein says. Right? Nothing pains a person more than hard critical thinking, says Martin Luther King. Right? Like, yeah, that's what it's going to take, some hard critical thinking. Yeah, we've got to figure out this roof, but it can be done. I have no doubt if they can do San Miguel Chapel, we can figure out our church, right? Built a couple hundred years later, frankly.
And we've had 4 companies come out, give us quotes, and they all said it's absolutely possible. But they say the first thing is reduce your consumption.
Yeah.
And then something.
Yeah, don't put more solar panels on than you may need. Don't incur a cost there. Change some of your behaviors and retrofit, reduce your footprint, and then we'll cover it with solar. Right? It's stupid to just pay more and never change.
That's one thing, I looked at several houses, I looked at the solar, and they either say, our roof doesn't make the right, like that, but most of them would say, they were bigger houses, most of them, and most of them would say, we can't give you enough solar panels on the roof to do consumption, but then, you know, that was the missing link, was, here's how much we give you, with what you have.
Right.
Can you get down with that?
But there were some basic things, closing windows. This door and a lot of doors, if you ever see leaves under a door that's not normally open, there's a problem there. Okay, there's sunlight coming through. That
Single
means
pane windows
heat.
right there, right? You touch them,
We were
they're
out of town for several months at a time.
And-
There was all kinds of dust.
and that's all the
Window, and
yeah.
we closed windows and doors, just
Yep.
like 4 feet in.
And that's all the energy audit did, was basically say, here's changes. Now you don't have to make them. You can pick and choose, right? There's some that may be more cost offensive, may make more sense, may be too politically difficult. But it's just said, here's all the things you could do, right? Double pane those windows. Maybe you don't want to take that on. Maybe it's a royal pane and it's too expensive and not worth it. Fine. Then you figure out other areas, right? But the thing is to have the conversation and figure it out, right? That's the whole point. It's not telling you, you got to do all this. It's like have the conversation, figure it out, and understand the implications. So that's today's presentation.
That's the other thing about shop and windows.
But anyone who wants to be involved in this work, totally would love to have you. Love to, we're trying to get that committee going. And my promise to it is it will not be like a typical committee where you just drain your will to live to go to it. It is, let's make a change. Let's do something good. Let's make a difference. One day when you're going to flip these lights on, they're going to turn right on and be like, what just happened? Right. And then someone's going to, and another day you're going to walk in and it's just going to go on. Right. And then you're going to walk out and they're going to go off. So, that's the kind of stuff we can do. But we need that culture, that political will within the congregation, and we need to have honest conversations. There are some people that are going to say, it's important, but I don't really care because I'm not going to be around for it. So I'd rather have nicer carpet, right? We have to have those honest conversations.
And I'm having to make that connection, maybe with the e-news, the website, is say we put in $200. We made this impact this month, and this is how it's going to translate. So that it's tangible, because it is a tragedy of the commons. We come here, we use it, we go home, we don't see what happens. We don't see the bills.
All right, happy to answer any questions. Always stay. If you're not on the Earth Keepers newsletter, you have your email to Jen, she'll add you. A lot of you already are. We have 400 different congregations and leaders on that already from all over the country. And so we're just chunking away. I mean, this is all you can do, right? Do the best you can. So, but yeah, for those going to the 11 o'clock, that's fine.